Ronald Defeo Jr. was convicted of knocking out his entire family while they slept in their beds. Now, these disturbing events would inspire the well-known series Amityville Horror. Ronald Defeo Jr., aka Butch, was born September 26, 1951 in Brooklyn, New York, to parents Ronald Sr., also known as Big Ronnie, and to Louise Defeo. His nickname growing up was Butch. So Ronald Jr. was the oldest child in the Defeo family, as his parents went on to have 4 more kids. The Defeo family grew up comfortably in a middle-class family. Big Ronnie was a car salesman, which gave him a lot of extra income, and this could afford the finer things in life. But Big Ronnie was also a big freaking tyrant. He had terrible anger issues, and he would take out his frustrations on his family. Felt like they were constantly walking on eggshells, scared of the next time their dad would blow up. Sadly, Ronald Jr. got the brunt of this rage. He was the oldest child, and with that, there was a lot of expectation forced onto him. Butch couldn't seem to catch a break. His father was abusive, so home life didn't feel safe, and kids would taunt and pick on him constantly, so school didn't feel safe either. But as he got older and more mature, Butch started standing up for himself a lot more. This was almost always through violence and random outbursts. Ronald had gotten into physical fights with his friends and even his dad. He really liked to scrap. It's nice that his parents wanted to help Ronald out. After all, he's their oldest kid, but they were pretty clueless when it came to disciplining him, which only came in the form of money. They literally would pay him to be in a better mood. Ronald's dad would give him a monthly allowance regardless of how many times he did or didn't show up to work. Ronald's family could just tell that he was going through something because his behavior wouldn't let up. Some people like a little bit of chaos in their life, and Ronald was one of them. He insisted that he was fine though. He wasn't troubled at all, he was just a kid. With that, the doctor's visits stopped, and that's where Ronald's involvement with substances began. By 17 years old, Ronald was actively using substances, which kind of turned him into a loose cannon and only added to the violence in the Defeo house. Luis and Big Ronnie were trying everything, including buying him a brand new $14,000 speedboat and gifting him a car that he didn't deserve. Because of course, his father owned the dealership, his dad was a top salesman, and lucky for him, they gave him a job. Everything was handed to this kid. No wonder he's so spoiled. But Butch kept having violent outbursts that only got more and more aggressive as time went on. Once, during a really heated argument with his dad, he pointed a 12-gauge firearm at point-blank range to his head. The weapon ended up malfunctioning and didn't go off. I feel like it would take you down a couple of notches, right? Having your own flesh and blood point a shotgun at your face. One night, Ronald was pissed off. Per usual, he believed his salary wasn't enough and demanded more. But thankfully for Ronald, one of his jobs at a car dealership was money management. You know, depositing money into the bank at the end of the day. It was over $20,000. Ronald had the brilliant idea to steal some money while he was at it. Life was boring for him and he needed something else to tickle his fancy. Good old Butch decided that splitting the money with an accomplice for robbing a bank was just his speed. They followed through with the plan and somehow they were able to get away. But once the police came to interview Butch in connection with the robbery, he completely flipped his lid. This guy had zero idea of how to play it cool. He even refused to go down to the station and point out the potential suspects from a lineup. His total and complete lack of cooperation, of course, only made him look more guilty to the police. When his dad, Big Ronnie, heard about the robbery and his son's lack of cooperation, he had a pretty good idea he might be behind the whole operation. He confronted Ronald about his suspicions, which obviously led to a massive blow-up fight where Ronald threatened to kill his dad. But sadly, on November 13th, 1974, Ronald Defeo Jr. would finally act on his words. Early in the morning, he grabbed a firearm from his secret weapon stash. He went into his parents' bedroom and fired bullets at Louise and Big Ronnie, who both passed away. They were only 43 years old at the time. Next, Ronald entered the bedroom of his brothers, 12-year-old Mark and 9-year-old John Matthew. And just like his parents, they were slain with bullets. Finally, Ronald went into his sister's bedroom and did the exact same thing. Both 18-year-old Dawn and 13-year-old Allison were face down in their beds, lifeless. All of these shots were from point-blank range. Mind you, he committed all of these crimes within 15 minutes. Well, after Ronald was done, he showered and went to work early. On his way, he threw any crucial, incriminating evidence down a storm drain. He was found sleeping in his car outside of the dealership, but continued on with his day as if nothing had happened. The other employees didn't think much of Big Ronnie's absence. He had been injured playing football the month before and needed crutches and a wheelchair to get around. He was in physical therapy as well. Butch told the cops that he got bored from work and left around noon to hang out with some friends. And then around 6:30 that evening, Butch ran into a bar in Amityville, Long Island. He shouted to anyone that could hear that someone had iced his parents and needed help. Like ASAP Rocky. Now, a group of patrons dashed back to Ronald's house and found the entire family in their beds, face down, motionless, and riddled with bullets. The only surviving member of the family was Ronald Jr. Now, the incident was reported to the police, who obviously brought Butch in for questioning. Their surviving son told officers that he believed the massacre was carried out by a hitman hired by the mob. Big Ronnie was known to get into some suspicious activity, so it wasn't totally off. According to Butch, there was a man named Louis Fellini who was suspected to be involved. Now, Louis apparently held a massive grudge against the Defeos, but this didn't go very far because Louis' name was cleared. He was actually out of town while the crimes were committed. Police still didn't have a suspect, but they held Butch in protective custody while they continued the investigation. They started at the Defeo house to look around and gather evidence. Investigators ended up finding a box for the same firearm used in the killings, a .35 caliber Marlin. It had a tag that showed it had been recently purchased. This was highly incriminating. But Ronald wasn't gonna let that stop him. He would switch up his story every so often when new evidence was provided to him. Ronald started spitting this yarn about Louis Fellini coming into his home and pointing a firearm to his head while an accomplice went through the house, knocking out the whole family. He didn't keep up this story for very long though, and finally caved. He confessed to committing the violent acts and said, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." The trial began in the following year, 1975. Now, Butch had an attorney and some coaching, and he would go into court with a whole new story. And this time, he was pleading insanity. He stated that he heard voices in his head, and they told him to do it. In fact, he believed his own family had the plot to kill him, and he did it out of self-defense. The first psych eval Ronald was given, the doctor said he had suffered from dissociation and was neurotic. Another doctor was brought in, and while he agreed with some of the diagnoses, he found that Ronald had an antisocial personality disorder. He was also a blatant narcissist and was totally unaware of his actions. And in classic Ronald's fashion, he switched up the story one more time. And this time, he blamed the whole thing on his sister, Dawn. Ronald said that he, Dawn, and a friend of theirs were the ones who committed the heinous crime, but Dawn was the first one to approach Ronald about ending their father's life. He alleged that Dawn killed their siblings to eliminate any witnesses. And even pleading insanity in court wouldn't get Donald to confess to his siblings' slayings. He even claimed that the night of the big event, they were supposed to go to their grandparents' house in Brooklyn, and that obviously didn't end up happening. Apparently, Dawn made her way into each bedroom, ordered her siblings to lay face down, and took them out with a rifle. When Ronald saw that Dawn had iced his siblings, he freaked out and wrestled her for the weapon. He eventually overpowered her, knocked her on her head, and shot her directly in the head by accident. After some time, Ronald Defeo Jr. would finally come clean and confess to the slaying of his family in their beds. In a 1992 interview with Ronnie, he said that his attorney, William Weber, told him to take the insanity plea. William told him that there would be potential books, movies, etc., opportunities in the following years, and by doing this, they might have something to sell. Now, if this is true, that is super messed up, but you gotta take everything that Butcheroni says with several grains of salt. Now, the main focus after Ronald confessed was, what the heck was his motive? Why would a guy want to kill his entire family? And was he alone in doing this? There was a lot of questions that needed answers. The case has a few conspiracies to it that I also find super interesting. Number one, each family member was killed the exact same way, face down with their hands over their heads. It didn't look like there was a struggle, and they hadn't been moved after they were killed. Ronald admitted to administering sedatives to the family, but even still, there were no traces of those types of substances in their bodies, according to the autopsy report. And remember when I said that Big Ronnie had an injury from playing football? Well, he couldn't lay on his stomach because of this, but yet he was still found face down. Was he instructed to do this? Number two, everyone is asleep at 3 a.m. Well, mostly everyone. But If I heard a rifle go off, I feel like I would wake up. Maybe not the first one, but at least like the second or the third. So how is it possible that no one was able to escape? No neighbors reported anything that night or early that morning either. Regardless of the small, easily disprovable conspiracy surrounding the case, Ronald Defeo Jr. was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder in 1975. After a 7-week-long trial. He was serving 6 25-to-life sentences, failing to appeal multiple times. In March 2021, he passed away at the age of 69. However, this case wouldn't just disappear as time went on. Not at all. In September of 1975, George and Kathy Lutz moved into the same home these horrific crimes were committed. 28 days later, they moved out. This would inspire the book series, The Amityville Horror, which, like most things these days, has been adapted into multiple TV shows and movies. So, what do you guys think? Do you believe that this guy Butch was working alone or with a team? I could definitely see how an accomplice could be involved, but this guy was sketch from the beginning. If you don't cooperate with the police in the investigation, as the only remaining family member, there's no wonder that you're gonna be on the top of the suspect list.